my name's Jade and today I'm going to be talking about my 2023 favourite books. My favourite books of 2023, some might say. I'm also going to be talking about some bookish statistics. This year was the first year that I actually had like a book spreadsheet, so I have a couple extra graphs than I usually do. I will leave all the different sections like timestamps, so if there's a section in particular that you want to watch, feel free to skip to that section, but I'll start with like the stats and some kind of observations of the year, check in with like my goals and see how I actually did, and then I'll talk about my favorite books, have a little mini like book awards ceremony at the end. If we start by whizzing through my Goodreads year in books, I read 107 books in 2023. I by no means like attempted to read 100 books, it just kind of happened. I really like getting through books quickly. There are multiple reasons for this. I'm pretty happy with that number. According to Goodreads, that's 31,324 pages, but we'll take that with a grain of salt because graphic novels and poetry collections, it's not all going to be consistently the same. The shortest book I read was Gaia by Isabel and Imogen Greenberg. This is 96 pages long. It's a children's picture book technically. And the longest book I read at 827 pages was The Priory of the Orange Tree. I'm not surprised. This was by far the longest book I read this year. According to Goodreads, the average book length was 292 pages, but I'm not convinced. I think that the poetry collections and the graphic novels and all of those kinds of, you know, the novellas, they're skewing it to be shorter. I think in terms of like actual novels, the average length I would guess would be between 300 and 400 pages. The most shelved book I read in 2023 was The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. That doesn't surprise me. 5,501,463 people read that, or shelved it, I suppose. And the least shelved was Roman History 101 by Christopher M. Bellito. This is more like a mini course, like made up of 12 half-hour lectures, if you will, about Roman history. It's like the very basics. Average rating was 3.7 stars, which tracks. I give mostly 3 and 4 stars. The highest rated book I read on Goodreads was Lore Olympus Volume 4, which has an average of 4.43 stars. I wasn't expecting that. I was thinking like maybe Hobbit or Priory of the Orange Tree. It's interesting that it's Volume 4 because Volume 5 is out. So I don't know why Volume 4 was so beloved, but I mean, hey, I love Lore Olympus too. I get it. The first book I finished this year was Neon Gods by Katie Roberts. The last book I read this year was Cruel Seduction, also by Katie Roberts. This is the first book in the series, and then Cruel Seduction is the most recent book in the series, so kind of a full circle moment. Now if we go onto my little book spreadsheet, see if there's any extra data that might be of interest. Data, look at me go. Oh, this is interesting. Of all the books I read, 58% of them were audiobooks. 62 books were audiobooks. Only 40 books, 37%, like a third of the books I read were books that I physically sat down and read like as a physical book. I think there are a couple ebooks and one mixed media, which I don't know what that is. I couldn't tell you. I don't know why that surprises me so much because I always have an audiobook on the go. I typically read 2 books at once, and so the other one, sometimes it's audiobook, sometimes it's a physical book. So that will naturally lead to me listening to more audiobooks than I do reading physical books. Something like slightly less surprising is that 75% of the books I read this year were standalones. Only 25% were part of the series. That doesn't surprise me. But genre wheel, I read mostly fantasy this year. That was the biggest chunk, if you will. 21 fantasy books, 19%. I'm actually a little bit surprised as well that this is the biggest percentage because it didn't feel like I read a ton of fantasy. In fact, I distinctly remember thinking like I miss reading fantasy. I don't feel like I read fantasy as often, and yet here it is taking up the biggest section. That's really interesting. So maybe I miss like more traditional like high fantasy. Maybe it was the type of fantasy I was reading. I expect like a lot of the graphic novels I was reading were also fantasy, so that might have helped the number. We have romance at 14, mystery at 13, historical fiction at 13, myth and folklore at 11, all of that tracks. Mystery fiction 7, 8, non-fiction books. Yeah, those are my favourite genres, so that makes sense. And then also somewhat surprising to me was only 62 of the books I read this year were novels. I read 11 novellas, 9 non-fiction according to this graph, 8 graphic novels, 8 short stories. Huh? Okay. If you say so. 4 poetry collections and 2 plays. I'm happy with that. There's a good variety of other things because I like reading across different mediums and forms. And then the last chart that kind of is inspiring me here is the author's chart, which I'm going to show very quickly, but it's very hectic, so that's not going to stay up long. The author that I read from the most was Katie Robert, who, as we just discussed, is the author of the Dark Olympus series, and the predominant reason why she's my most read author is the Dark Olympus series. 5 books. You know, I started at the beginning of the year, I read the first 2 in January, I read like the second 2 in like April time, and I read the last one December. It was the last book I read. I also read The Dragon's Bride by her, but we have a couple that are like in second place. Agatha Christie. This is telling me 4, and I'm here to say no. I don't think it is. I think it's 6. I read 4 short story collections by her this season ones. I also read The Mousetrap and then there were none. So Agatha Christie and Katie Robert are actually tied, but then the other one that kind of is a higher number is Emma Donoghue. I read 3 Emma Donoghue books this year, which is really exciting to me and what I wanted to bring up because she's one of my favourite authors, and I knew that having read only 2 of her books it was more of like an inkling, but then this year really confirmed to me that she's definitely one of my favourite authors, and I really want to go through and read all of her work. She has written so much, like she's written novels and non-fiction and plays and short stories. She's written so much. When you actually sit down and go through her Wikipedia, it's really overwhelming, so I'm just gonna start with her novels. So that's really exciting to me that I finally started working my way through her work a little bit more. And the last one I want to talk about really quickly is Miriam Toews, who I only read 2 of her books, but I adored both of them. After having read like the first one, I was pretty sure this was an author I was going to love, and then after reading the second one, yeah. And so it's very similar to the Emma Donoghue situation, where I really think she is probably one of my favourite authors, and I just need to read a little bit more of her work to be sure. A couple other authors that I read for the first time this year were Ashley Poston, who I adored. I read The Dead Romantics very earlier this year. I read Emily Henry for the first time this year. I read Sally Thorne for the first time this year. I also read my first Tessa Moshfegh, which was interesting. Cozy fantasy I read for the first time this year. And then in terms of books that had been sitting heavy on my mind that I'd finally read this year, some mashed potato books, as Books Unbound refers to them. I started listening to Books Unbound this year, the podcast. The Secret History by Donna Tartt. That one, ever since I heard of it, I wanted to read it. Babel. I read Babel this year. My first R.F. Kuang. Haha. More conquering fears of big books and reading new authors I've been wanting to read forever. Priory of the Orange Tree. Again, I'd wanted to read that ever since I heard about it, but I heard about this one like when it came out, like a little bit unlike Secret History and Babel. Like this one had been living in my mind the longest. The weight lifted off my shoulders and onto my bookshelf is immense. And while we're talking about Priory, this is a really loose connection segue actually. I was gonna be like, that's kind of like, now there's a prequel to that one, let's talk about series. If you watched my 2023 goals, I did mention this in that video. I will preface, of all the goals I set, I didn't do it. I didn't read the sequels I wanted to read. So if we go through those sequels I said I wanted to read at the beginning of this year, oh, the shame. The Atlas Paradox by Olivia Blake, and I knew there was a good chance I wasn't going to get to this one, and I really wanted to reread the Atlas 6 at the end of the year, then read the Atlas Paradox, and then I'd be ready for when the 3rd book came out this year. I didn't do any of that. The Ask and the Answer by Patrick Nest, the 2nd book in the Chaos Walking trilogy. I own it. I don't read it. 2nd book in the Regeneration trilogy by Pat Barker, The Eye on the Door. Didn't read it. The problem is the first books in both of those trilogies, I read them in 2020. So the likelihood of me reading them is slipping away with the seconds, the minutes that pass by. But the 3rd one was the second book in the Defy the Night trilogy. It's Defend the Dawn, and I did read that one. Of all the, I can't believe of all the ones that I read, that was the one. But I did. I audiobooked it and I read it, and I think I probably will read the third book pretty promptly after it comes out. So I did 1 out of 4, but it's not great. It's not great. But the other goals, there were more. Oh, talking about series, I wanted to read Children of Dune. I didn't read that one. That's one of the books I said at the beginning of last year that I wanted to read. I didn't read it. I also didn't read The Temple of Fortuna, which is the third book in the Wolf Den trilogy. It came out last year and I was really anticipating it, but I think the timing it came out in September, I think, and I knew I wanted to read Priory at the end of the year, and that took up a lot of time. But I have every faith that I will this year, probably during the summer, because that's when I read the first two and I want that experience again. But my anticipated releases, the ones that I really wanted to get through other than The Temple of Fortuna, were Hell Breaks Loose by Derek Landy and One for My Enemy by Olivia Blake, and I read both of those. It's actually kind of ironic that One for My Enemy is the one I've got down here, and you'll see why later in the video. I had this chunk of Greek myth retellings that I wanted to get through. 1,000 Ships by Natalie Haynes, Stoneblind by Natalie Haynes, Electra by Jennifer Saint, Sister Song by Lucy Holland, which isn't actually a myth retelling but lived in that section, and The Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker. And I read all 5 of those. Those were like the ones I really wanted to get through, and I got through all of them. I even read Atalanta by Jennifer Saint as well. And then graphic novels. I really wanted to read the first 2 volumes of The Sandman, which I did. I read the first 2 volumes. I would have liked, I think, to be further in, but I'm considering DNFing the series, so I'm not too mad about that. I really wanted to reread Monstrous. I've read the first 5 volumes and I haven't read anything after that. 6, 7 and 8 are all out, and I didn't read 1. So bummer. We'll just roll that on to 2024. But I didn't think I was gonna like be up to date on many of my series come the end of the year, but I caught up with a couple right at the end of the year. I'm up to date with Saga and I am up to date with Lore Olympus. I read both volume 4 and 5 at the very end of the year. I am behind on Something Is Killing the Children, and I am behind of House of Slaughter. House of Slaughter I am 2 behind. Something Is Killing the Children though, only 1 behind as of right now, 6, and 7 comes at the very beginning of 2024, and I believe that's gonna be the last one. So that's fine with me. I'm happy to like marathon them together when 7 comes out. It's not great with the graphic novels, but it could also be worse. I wanted to read between 3 and 5 classics, and I did. This is my definition of a classic, I will preface. Hamlet. I'd never read Hamlet by Shakespeare, so that's again a good weight lifted off of me. We have Agnes Grey by Anne Bronte, which I really enjoyed. The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. I've been wanting to read that one for a really long time. Christmas Stories by Charles Dickens. It's Charles Dickens, it counts. And Metamorphosis by Ovid. I mean, it's a different kind of classic, but it's a classic. And another goal was I wanted to read more short story collections because there were so many on my TBR and I didn't read many of them. By my counting, it's 7. So I conquered that goal as well. I only wanted to read a couple and I read a whole 7. Agatha really helps me out there. 4 of them were from her. With that, we can move on to my little mini book awards. So we'll start with my least favorite book of the year. The book that I disliked the most was Perfume by Patrick Suskind. I heard so many good things about this and it was just so boring. I've never been so uninterested in a book. Well, I probably have been. I haven't felt about a book for a long time, like the way I felt about it, this one, like it's been a while since something bored me so much. I'm not going to tell you what it's about. If you are curious, you can look into it for yourself. I think a really big part of the problem of this one is the synopsis, because what the premise says is about, even like the little line that kind of accompanies it, I'm not reading out to you for a reason, because that doesn't happen until like 2/3 of the way through, like 3/4 maybe. It doesn't happen till like the end. And then just the way it ended out, like it was such a waste of my life. And so many people love it. It really wasn't for me. So now I want to talk about my favorite like novella, graphic novel, non-fiction, poetry, that kind of stuff. My favorite short story collection I read this year was The Haunting Season Ghostly Tales for Long Winter Nights, written by a wide array, 8 award-winning authors. I really enjoyed, if not loved, found really interesting, was spooked by whatever. Really, like, every story in here really impacted me, bar maybe like one or two. But even then, I still see there was one that I think was my least favorite, but I think about that one quite often. There are so many really good ones in here. The Natasha Pulley one was so heartwarming. The Kieran Millwood Hargrave and Imogen Hermes Gowar, I like need to remember which is which, but both of those like really stuck with me. Kieran Millwood Hargrave's, that was so chilling that like just has wedged itself into my brain. So good. I highly recommend this collection. Now for novellas, I have two. First one is Arch Conspirator by Veronica Roth. This is like a sci-fi Oedipus retelling that I was really surprised by. Like, I just enjoyed it so much. I thought it was so clever, it was so well written, just flew through it. It was so well done and so intriguing, and I really enjoyed it. And I know that Veronica Roth has another novella coming out in 2024, and I'm definitely going to be reading that. The other one is in the Darklands Tales series, which is like historical fiction based on historical events from Scotland. And that's Rizzio by Denise Mina. This is about Mary Queen of, well, it's about David Rizzio, who is Mary Queen of Scots, I think, advisor. There was a coup to like have him be killed. It was so well written, it was so compelling. I knew a little bit about Mary Queen of Scots just from like stuff I picked up over the years and like the film, but I didn't know a ton, and this really like made me want to look more into her and everything, that like just like that kind of chunk of Scottish history. So intrigued by it. I think about it pretty often now. That is for a novella to do that, that's a big ask. So this punched a hard punch. Two poetry collections, and again, it's pretty rare for me to like, normally I'm kind of like trying to struggle to come up with what my favorite poetry collection was. So I wanted to mention really quickly Carol Ann Duffy's The World's Wife, which I really enjoyed. I loved the premise of this. We're taking like famous female characters and writing poems from their perspective. They were all really well structured, really well written. Carol Ann Duffy is definitely someone that I'm now going to want to read more from. But my favourite was I Would Leave Me If I Could by Halsey. I'm a really big fan of Halsey's music, but I didn't know how I was going to feel about this. I've not read like celebrity poetry before. This was my first one. I adored it. I listened to the audiobook version where she reads it herself, and I don't know if that helped. Maybe the amount of poems in here that just like, whoa, I needed to take a second. I think the language was really beautiful. The themes she talked about, it spoke to me. What can I say? I really loved it. And then for non-fiction, I mean, this is easy. My favourite non-fiction book this year was A Fatal Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, Murder in Ancient Rome by Emma Southern. If you're interested in Roman history and you like true crime, this is the book for you, my friend. And it's so well written, it's so funny, and Emma throws in so many like really random facts and pieces of knowledge that you don't really need to know, but you should know. I listened to the audiobook of this one, and the narrator is quite a posh tone. She's like has a RP accent, and then hearing her have to read aloud the funny silly things that Emma wrote was so funny. So it's kind of made up of like different sections. We have like murder on the Senate floor, murder in Roman law, murder in the family, murder in marriage, and so on and so forth. And each of those sections will have like 3 people's examples, so we'll learn about like specific murders. Through them we're kind of learning about how Romans thought about murder and like Roman society just in general. There was like so many things about Romans in general that I learned through the lens of murder, like the way they thought about crime and the way they thought about death. It really tells you a lot about a civilization. And with that, we get into my honourable mentions. I have quite a few because that seems to be the theme for this year. I'll start with Melmoth by Sarah Perry. I read The Essex Serpent in either, I think it was 2022, and I really enjoyed it. And Melmoth is very similar but also very different. It's really interesting to compare the two actually. The themes were very similar and the tone were very similar, but like the scale was very different. Like Melmoth feels like so blown out because we have so many different people's stories in here, whereas The Essex Serpent we're very much following our crew, and tonally like this is set in Prague, that's set in like the muddy cold English moors. But like the thought experiment of it I found so interesting. It was really well written. I think of the two I do prefer The Essex Serpent a little bit, but I think it was still a really well done book. I think I give it like a 9 out of 10. It's really interesting and it's really like the themes is stuck with me and like the character of Melmoth stuck with me, and I kind of wish she would leave me alone. And then we have one I read at the very beginning of the year, I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Hartman. I was so close to putting this on my favourite list. Of all these honourable mentions, this one was the closest to being on my favourites list. Why isn't it then? Honestly, I don't know. I think if there was a number 11, this would be number 11. I just have reasons for my number 10 being my number 10. That's it. It was so clever. It was really well written. I thought I was so interested by this premise, and it's very ambiguous. Following women who are trapped in a cage underground and they don't know why they're trapped there. And our protagonist, all of her life that she can remember, she's been stuck in this cage. She has this really interesting perspective because she doesn't know how the world used to be, whereas all these women she's stuck with do remember how the world was before they were stuck in this cage for a reason they don't know why. And I will say, I think you could be easily frustrated by the lack of answers that you get, but I was so intrigued by it. I loved the themes we talk about. It talks a lot about like what makes us human, what makes us people, how we relate to each other. Next up we have Sister Song by Lucy Holland. This is on the list purely because I cannot stop thinking about it. I loved the world, I loved the magic system, I loved the writing. I think it's been a while so I can't really remember, like I might be like remembering it with rose tinted glasses. I just was so absorbed in it, and I like I said, I cannot stop thinking about it. I'm so excited for what Lucy Holland publishes next. I loved this kind of like time period. I don't fully know, it's like when the Saxons are invading. I don't actually know what, like, how you would call that time period, but it's also fantasy. I love the atmosphere of it, and I've been craving it so hard ever since, and nothing's done it for me. And then lastly we have Emma Cline's The Guest. The biggest reason this one is like I'm talking about it here is because of how well written it was. It was masterfully written. I think it's an interesting premise. I was really, again, I was absorbed, I was compelled to keep reading, I was really invested. I think it brought up a lot of interesting themes and ideas, but mostly I think it was really well written. I think it was really well crafted. The concept and the way it was executed, just it felt right. We're at the big drum roll moment, my top 10 books of 2023. I nearly said 4. Number 10 we have Masters of Death by Olivia Blake. Now, is this as like philosophical as like I Have Never Known Men? Maybe not. Is it as incredibly nuancedly well crafted as The Guest? Maybe not, but I would argue like Olivia Blake's books, writing style is gorgeous. Her characters feel so real. They do a lot of the time also have philosophical ideas in there. This one I think is my favorite of hers. I loved the characters so much. I had so much fun with them. The structure of this one, it's different. It's interesting. Typically it's not something I would love. It's one of those where you think it's about one thing for a while and then it just like pivots and you're like, oh no, this is actually what it's about. But it was such a fun time and I enjoyed both plot directions that I didn't mind. There's like 3 ships in here and 2 of them I shipped so hard. It's also really interesting in that we have like different gods and different beings. We have like vampires and werewolves and mer people, and we have like the Norse gods and we have the Greek gods, and we have like the Christian religion and all kinds of different faiths and mythologies and belief systems all interwoven in here, and I loved that aspect as well so much. I remember I might have given it a 9 out of 10. I had to put it on my favourites list. I think about it with so much fondness. Next up we have Emma Donoghue's Learned by Heart. This is Emma Donoghue's most recent book. We're following Eliza Rain, yes, who was Anne Lister's friend. Anne Lister was a diarist. She is like known for being like the first modern lesbian or something like that. Originally Emma set out to write a book about Anne Lister, and she ended up writing a book about Eliza because she found her so interesting and not many people know about her. Emma, I feel like I'm gonna sound like a scratch record, but her writing is so gorgeous. I love the fact that she can adapt it so well depending on the book she's writing and the tone of that book. All of her writing styles feel different in all of her books. She's the kind of person that if you were to pick up and read Room and then pick up and read like this, you would have no idea that they were the same author unless you knew. Same thing with her debut, Stir Fry, completely different writing style. I'm really glad that we got the chance to have this story told. It's such a cute like, I'm not undermining it when I'm saying cute. I'm saying cute in a really positive way. It's really sweet, it's really heartwarming and lovely, but also heartbreaking. I think it's important that Eliza Reign's history is told, and kind of we go between two different timelines, and so it's really interesting to see her past and then her present, and it's, yeah. I think there's a lot to be learned about the way women are treated, and kind of, because it's historical fiction, brings up some important things that would very often happen to women. Trying to be as spoiler free as possible, but it's very literary. Like, it takes a really long time for the plot to kick into gear. It's really slow, but I didn't mind it. I enjoyed it all the while, so there. I had to place this one, but I just knew that, like, when I looked at all the books I read this year, this was in my top 10, so it's ended up here. And that's Wayward by Amelia Hart. We follow 3 different women. They're all in the same kind of ancestral line, and they all have this connection to nature in a kind of witchy way. Wayward specifically is this house that, again, all of them end up at in one way or another. They're all going through very different situations, but all of them are wronged by men. I love stories about women wronged by men. I'm like sitting here remember like how it actually ended and what actually happened, and it just makes me so happy. I loved all 3 of these women so dearly. Loved the way they were connected. I'm starting to get a bit emotional, like, remembering these women. I think that's the one thing, like, why I didn't know where to place it. I don't think about it a ton, but it's one of those when I stop and really think about it, like, it really, like, hits me, like, somewhere in here. The writing style was gorgeous. I loved the themes, as I've mentioned. I think the way we split the 3 perspectives was really well done. I was never confused. It all felt very real. They felt very distinct. I listened to the audiobook. The audiobook was also really well done. I just enjoyed it so much, and I just love what it stands for. Okay, the sun is setting, so I've like readjusted my lighting. Hopefully it's a little more even now. Next we have Women Talking by Miriam Toews. I talked about Miriam Toews earlier. This was the first book I read of hers. I read it to watch the film. And I enjoyed the film adaptation as well, but I would say if you watched the film and you really liked it and you're thinking about reading the book, I would definitely recommend picking it up. The end's quite different. Between 2005 and 2009, in a remote Mennonite colony, over 100 girls and women were raped by what many thought were ghosts or demons. Their accounts were dismissed as wild female imagination. Women Talking is an imagined response to these real events. When women learn the truth, they meet secretly to discuss how to protect themselves and their daughter from future harm. They have 2 days to decide before the rapists are bailed out and brought home. These women were raped in their sleeps. They were told it was demons, but it was actually turned out to be men. They're arrested, but all of the men are going to go and bail them out, which is this happened. The bit that's fictional is they didn't have this like meeting to decide what they were going to do. I'm pretty sure they didn't. There was nothing they could do. But in this imagined response, have this meeting to discuss their options. They have like 2 or 3 different options. And it's just a meeting between these, like, I think there's maybe 6 of them, a range of different generations. It was such an interesting story, such an interesting idea. I love the premise. The writing was really strong and distinct. It had a very strong writing style. Like, there were speeches all reported. It's written down by a man. Augustus, his name is. He's the one that's kind of sitting and taking notes. And his part to play in it was really interesting as well. Like, at first I didn't like the fact that it was written by a man, but it makes sense the more the story goes on, and it really stuck with me, this one. So it's here, it's number 7 on my list. Number 6, we have The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. Now this moved around a lot. I feel like I always say this with my lists. It's very rare that I will like release a definitive list because I often change my mind and things get slipped around a lot. I think this one and the one after it are kind of equal in my brain. I'm not going to synopsize it for you because it's so long and too hard to synopsize it. I'll link the video where I discussed it down below if you don't actually know what it's about and you want to hear more about the premise. I just enjoyed the heck out of it. I loved the world so much. I loved being there. I really miss it actually. There were a couple parts that were rushed at the end. And if it weren't for that, I probably would have given this a 10 out of 10, and it probably would be like a favourite book of all time. Because it's so long, we get such a great arc and such a great scope, and there's so many riddles and things to figure out, and I loved like the investigation aspect and the way we learned so much as we went through the book. It was just so epic. And then next up we have The Marriage Portrait by Maggie O'Farrell. I couldn't make up my mind how I felt about this one when I finished it, because I enjoyed it so much. I love the premise. Like the first half of this book, again, I thought it was going to be a new favourite. From the midway point onwards, it kind of, I basically knew what was going to happen, and then that happened. Though it didn't happen exactly how I imagined it would, but because of that, like, main driving force was supposed to be like this kind of mysterious aspect, but I called it really early on. Without that, I did feel like it was missing something, but I enjoyed it so much. I loved the way it was written. It was really beautifully written. I think the character work was really well done. I felt really strongly about characters in the beginning that weren't even in it for very long. I teared up multiple times in the first half, and I think I teared up at the end as well, probably. We're following a young girl, Lucrezia is her name. Follow her over a long period of time. I rooted for her and I wanted the best for her. And it was so transportive. I was just whisked away to like Italy in the 1500s, and who doesn't want to be in Italy in the 1500s? I mean, come on. Like narratively, the way we start and like we flash through time was really interesting. But I also know that I have quite a few like problems with it. It's really interesting, but I have to call it one of my favorite books of the year, and I felt this way after reading it. I knew that like it was one of my favorite books that I read that month, even though logistically it has flaws. We have Clytemnestra by Costanza Cassati. Now Clytemnestra is one of my favorite Greek myth characters. I think she's so fascinating, and I think like is murder ever good? No, but I'm not mad about it in this instance. This version of her story, I've only read I think one other, Electra by Jennifer Saint, which I also really loved, but it was such a different take. We follow her and her childhood and her like her Spartan family, her siblings, so much more. I just found it fascinating. I just was hooked. I needed to know everything. The writing style was also really lyrical and gorgeous. The emotional punch it packed was intense. I just think there was a slight point in which we sped forward too much, and I wanted that to slow down just a little bit. That's my only really kind of flaw I have with it. I was just so impressed by it. I enjoyed the heck out of this. Then next up we have one that honestly was pretty low down on the list for a really long time, because I think emotionally I don't care about this one as much as some of the other ones I've just mentioned, like Clytemnestra and The Marriage Portrait, but so well done that this is where it's ended up. It's Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. I can't even remember, when did this come out? Was it this year or last year? Last year, and it got so much hype. Kind of think it's deserved. It's literary fiction. We're following a friendship over time. They grew up in the 80s and then they meet again in college and they build a video game together, and then we kind of just like keep going through like a long period of their lives. The way it was written was really interesting. Like each section kind of had a different take. We were kind of alternating between perspectives, and there's a couple sections in here that were really cleverly done, kind of a little bit creative and experimental almost. It's just really good. I don't know what else to say. Words are failing me. Utterly brilliant. In this sweeping, gorgeously written novel, Gabrielle Zevin charts the beauty, tenacity and fragility of human love and creativity. It talks a lot about creativity, and like it also has really intricate relationships, like friendships, romantic relationships, family, so that I loved it felt really nuanced in that way, and I think it spoke a lot. There are a lot of lines in here that I was like, yes, that, as you can see. Next up is another Emma Donoghue and that is The Wonder. I read this at the very beginning of the year. It wasn't the first book I read, obviously, because that was Neon Gods. But I technically started Neon Gods in 2022 and finished at the beginning of 2023. I think this was one of the very first books I remember properly reading in 2023. And I was like, it's too soon to have peaked. But I was wrong. It was so fascinating. This is like a mystery, but it's kind of like a literary mystery. It's very slow. But I was just like, oh, I was on my edge of this the entire time. I flew through it. It's about a girl who stopped eating. She's not eaten for like 4 months or something, and yet she's not died. She should be dead and she's not, and she's like not incredibly sick either. So they send a nurse and a nun nurse to observe and try and like see if anything, just observe if this is actually a miracle or not. And it takes place in Ireland. I can't remember when exactly. I want to say like the 1800s. Lib was trained by Florence Nightingale, so it's sometime after the Crimean War. If Emma Donoghue wrote it, then it's well written. That is assured. The symbols in here were so strong, they were so effective, and the motifs and the reoccurring themes, kind of slow horror of what's going on and like the priorities the people around this poor girl have. It was so fascinating, and I rooted for our characters so hard. I made me so emotional. Yeah, I just adored it. I think a lot of people will take something away from this, whether it's like the heart that I do or whether it's just like the mystery and like what's going on here. There's so much to this premise. It's so meaty that I think a lot of people can read this and take something away from it. Next up, at number 2, we're getting to like the creme de la creme now. We have The Bandit Queens by Perini Schroff. Now this is just, it's a perfect book. I have zero criticism. Like everything it tries to do, it does, and then some. We're following Gita. Her husband disappeared, and so it's assumed that she killed him, and so then one of her friends comes to her and she's like, I want to kill my husband, how did you do it? And so she gets sucked into this like just wild story, and then it gets so out of hand. A lot about like friendships, like female friendships, because other people of the community end up kind of getting involved. There's like, it talks about second chances and second loves, the way society views us and our reputation and what that actually means. But it's also so entertaining because it's so wild and it's so funny. It's hilarious. I laughed constantly. It felt so like, for a story that has it's got a lot of darkness in there, but it never feels too dark. It always feels kind of hopeful and inspiring and funny. It was just perfect. I gave it a 10 out of 10. And at number 1, my favourite book of 2023, we have Fight Night by Miriam Toews. There's a reason why I wanted to mention Emma Donoghue and Miriam Toews in the authors section. It's because they both showed up on my favourites list twice. So this is the second Miriam Toews book I read. We're following a kid. We don't know her name. We don't know her age. She has a nickname, but it's like Swiv. I don't know if that's actually her name or a nickname. Swiv lives with her mother, her pregnant mother, and her grandmother all in one house. So we have 3 generations in one house, and her mother's husband, her dad, has somewhat recently left. Swiv's got in trouble in school, so she's staying at home, and her nan is kind of teaching her these strange life lessons. And we're also like, her mum is very stressed because her partner's just left. And we're just kind of following their lives for a little bit. The narrative arc made so much sense. Like, it's literary and it is quite slow, but it made so much sense to me. I got so unbelievably attached to these characters. They felt so incredibly real and flawed and complicated. It talks about mental health and our lives and like the way we're supposed to be living now. There are so many lines in here that were just gorgeous and that I had to highlight and underline. Such a beautiful story, and it's just like, it's wedged itself into me. It's one of those that just like becomes a part of you, and you can't really describe why, you can't describe how. It just has, like, you know, your top tier favorite books. I haven't stopped thinking about it since I read it, and I read it in like March, and that's that. It's my favorite book of the year. It just is. I knew right off the bat, there was no debating. Okay, this lighting is horrific. I think I fixed it a little bit, maybe. Anyway, my favourite covers of the year. Oh, there's a non-fiction book I read called Twilight Cities. I'm blanking on the author's name at this moment in time, but it looks like this, and I adore this cover. That's why I bought it. There was a window display at the shop we were at, Hatchards in London, and me and my dad both noticed it. He was like, would you like that? And I was like, yes. And he said, I can buy that for you for your birthday if you like. And I said, thank you. Oh, I mean, I have to mention, where is it? Where is it? I have to mention The Priory of the Orange Tree. This has an incredible cover. I'm obsessed with this like dragon, the way it's like raised and metallic. It's just gorgeous. And the colours, they're so vivid. I have the Waterstones exclusive edition of the Marriage Portrait, and I'm just obsessed with the way it looks. It's so beautiful. Also love the cover of Wayward. I love the colours they chose. I love this kind of really natural background and then this bright pink bold font. I think the spine is really clever. I have a version with sprayed edges that are also stunning. It's just a really nice looking book. Oh, and there's also like a bird flying in the corners. Can I show you? Look at it go. I'm trying to think if there's any that aren't like sitting around me. Matrix by Lauren Groff. I love that cover. The foiling on that one's really beautiful. I love the cover of Electra as well. That one is stunning. The Adventures of Amina Al-Sarafi is gorgeous, and it has a gorgeous spine as well with foiling on it. Ah, I love the cover for Now She Is Witch, despite it being a little disappointing. The cover is stunning. Yeah, I think those are all the covers I wanted to mention, and so with that, the 2023 favourites video is concluded. I would love to hear what your favourite books of 2023 were down below in the comments section. And that is all I have for this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have an amazing morning, afternoon, evening / night. My name's Jade. I hope I see you again next time. Goodbye.